We're live.
Hello, welcome to Fundamental Freedoms. My name's Steve Burgess. I'm broadcasting from my home in southern Utah.
And I'm David Sabine. I'm broadcasting from my home in London, Ontario. This is Fundamental Freedoms. We are streaming at Facebook. We also upload these videos to YouTube, where you can subscribe and hit that bell so that you're notified when we upload the next video. We also publish these videos at fundamentalfreedoms.locals.com. It's a platform founded by Dave Rubin, and just a nice place to carry on conversation, and you'll find us there.
Well, we're at Fundamental Freedoms. We believe three things strongly. We believe that you do not have to show up to a conversation ready to do battle, that it is okay to change your mind, and most importantly, it is okay to have a lot of respect for those people that you may disagree with. And that's what we're out to prove.
Every conversation we have, we try to abide by two sort of basic guidelines. One is that we are individuals. Our guest, whoever that is, in each stream is also an individual. And despite our affiliations and memberships and group circles, we don't expect anyone to speak on behalf of a group. We expect ourselves and our guests to speak on behalf of themselves as individuals. The second is that we try to avoid undefined they statements. So if we use the word they, we try to be very clear about who that refers to, or back to you, Steve.
So tonight we're really excited. We have Dr. Antony Davies. He is an economist, a speaker, an author. He's the Milton Friedman Distinguished Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education. He's published op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, New York Daily News, Forbes, Investors Daily, CNN.com, among others. Together with James Harrigan, he hosts a weekly podcast called Words and Numbers. I'm a big fan. Highly encourage you to check that out. He and James also recently published a book entitled Cooperation and Coercion. We are so pleased to welcome Antony Davies to our podcast tonight.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Antony. Appreciate you being here. Well,
before we started, I was just saying that Steve has followed Antony's work for quite a while, and I have not. So I'm meeting Antony tonight for the first time, and very honored that he would spend his time with us and have a conversation. Antony, it's so nice to meet you, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Before we get started in earnest, is there anything you'd like to add to our introduction or description of who you are and where you came from?
Well, just one. I'm a professor of economics at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh.
Awesome.
Yes, right. I was learning about Duquesne in the past weeks as we've been planning this conversation with you. Now, as a frame for our conversation with our guests, Steve and I have each prepared what we think is a fundamental question which we would like to understand better through our conversation with our guest. And so Steve and I are going to pose that question as a guide for, or as a framework for the conversation tonight. Steve, do you want to jump in and go first?
Certainly. So Antony, I'm looking for you to tell me some horror stories, I guess. I've really enjoyed some of your work that I've listened to, others as well, talking about the significant challenge that we have in this country, as well as in Canada. And maybe David can talk to that a little bit more. But the amount of debt that we have on top of all of the unfunded liabilities and promises that we've made, the stimulus spending, the packages that we continue to roll out, that debt seems like it's going in one direction and not looking back. My fundamental question is, does it matter? And what I mean by that is, we're the United States of America, and I don't know who on the world stage has an interest in having the United States stop producing, stop innovating, stop consuming, stop spending, stop leading, maybe in some cases. And so aren't we just going to continue to go in further debt, change the rules when it looks like we're about on the precipice? I guess we get together with our friends and they all say, well, we don't really want you guys hurting, so let's change the foundation, or we'll change it up. We'll change something and make it viable for you again and kick the can down the road. So again, my fundamental question, what I'd love to hear your opinion on and understand is, does the debt matter? And if it does, exactly how do those chickens come home to roost? What does that look like? And maybe you have some opinion about timeline, et cetera. So that's mine, David.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Mine is related to Steve's question. Antony, I think my fundamental question for you, given you're an economist and you know much more about this than I do, certainly, how resilient are Canada's, if you can speak to it, but also the USA's economic systems in the face of policy lurch from today's politicians? Could we see North America? Could we see in North America the meltdown that we saw in Cyprus, or could we see, the Zimbabwe currency collapse here in North America? Or how resilient are our systems to protect from such things? So hopefully through the conversation tonight, we give you a chance to kind of sort of flesh this out, and maybe Steve and I will ask related questions to this, but we just want to pass it over to you and pick up the conversation wherever you want at whatever point, and where do we go from here?
Well, that's useful because Steve's question leads right into your follow-up, David. Let's start with, does the debt matter? And I wish I could give you an answer. Let me say it differently. I wish I could give you one answer. There are actually a couple. On the one hand, the debt doesn't matter in that it's not something the government has to pay off. The debt's currently $28 trillion, roughly. It's not the case that at some point we have to come up with $28 trillion and hand it over to somebody. We can keep rolling this debt over the same way as an individual does. You have some credit card debt. You don't have to pay off the credit card at the end of the month. You just have to make the minimum monthly payment. And so long as you can keep on making the minimum monthly payment, you can carry the balance as long as you like. So too with the federal government. We have this $28 trillion debt. No, we don't have to pay it off. We do have to make the minimum monthly payments. And the equivalent there is the interest on the debt. Currently, the federal government's paying about 2.5%. So you do the math on 2.5% on 28 trillion, and you're somewhere around $750 billion to $500 billion, somewhere in that range per year. So what does that mean? Well, that's $500 billion to $750 billion of money that could be spent on other things. Improving our bridges, or more money to healthcare, or tax cuts so that people are paying less, right? So all those things that we could be doing with that money are off the table because we have to pay the interest. Okay. Well, that interest remains so long as the debt remains. So we're kind of we have this choice of, if you don't want to pay off the 28 trillion, you're going to have to keep on making these $500 to $750 billion payments every year ad infinitum. If you don't want to make those to the rest of eternity, then you're going to have to pay off the $28 trillion debt. So you can see how this works. Does it matter that we have this? In one sense, it doesn't, in that what we're talking about is occurring on the financial side of our ledger. That is, the debt means that there are people that we owe money to, people who are expecting the money back in the future, these sorts of things. It doesn't influence, or not directly, the productive side. So it could be the case, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, the federal government goes bankrupt tomorrow and says, well, we can't make good on any of our payments anymore. Um, we still have all the productive capacity we have now, right? Our factories don't disappear. Our natural resources don't disappear. Our population, their training, their technology doesn't disappear. We're able to produce as much after as we are before. What changes when you hit the financial skids like that are expectations. That there are people who are expecting to be paid interest on this debt. And when they cash in their bonds, they're expecting to get money back. And maybe that's not going to happen now. And now those people have to adjust their planning. So their expectations about the future have changed. So in that sense, that's what matters. The less the less financially stable the federal government becomes, the more uncertainty there is as to what people will or will not be able to do in the future, given the financial constraints. But then on the other side, we've got all the same productive capacities we had before. So that's kind of the good news and the bad news for debt.
Antony, could I interrupt you and just drill down on one point?
Sure.
So when we're talking about that $26 trillion, my understanding is that's a combination of U.S. citizens in a lot of cases who own bonds or some kind of U.S.-backed securities. And then obviously there's some foreign entities, foreign governments that are purchasing U.S.-backed securities essentially as well. Do you know what that balance is? I mean, is it predominantly foreign actors that we owe money to as a government, or is it predominantly, us?
Yeah, it's predominantly Americans in the form of Social Security, the Social Security Trust Fund, which is currently about $5 or $6 trillion that the federal government owes to the Social Security Trust Fund. There's a very large chunk that's owed to Americans, and by Americans I mean private individuals, be they American companies or individual people. Those two are the lion's share of what of the people to whom the federal government owes money. The next group down are foreigners, and there I mean foreign governments, foreign investors, foreign companies, and then the last group is the Federal Reserve. That the Federal Reserve has in effect loaned money to the federal government by purchasing treasury bills. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that as the federal government's borrowing has been accelerating over the past years, what's been happening is private Americans, American investors, American companies have been loaning more and more to the federal government, but the growth rate of their lending to the federal government has been slower than the growth rate of the federal government's debt. So too with foreign investors. They've been loaning more and more to the federal government, but the growth rate of how much they're lending has been slower than the growth rate of the federal debt. Meanwhile, we have the Social Security Trust Fund. The Social Security Trust Fund has actually stopped lending to the federal government because it doesn't have, it stopped running surpluses somewhere about 5 to 10 years ago. And now the Social Security Trust Fund is actually having to cash in its treasury bills. So it's needing the money back that it had loaned to the federal government previously. And what we have when all the dust settles is there's one group that has had to take up the slack here and substantially increase the rate of lending to the federal government, and that's the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is different than these other groups because unlike these other groups, Social Security or American investors or foreign investors, unlike those groups, when the Federal Reserve loans to the federal government, it increases the money supply. And in increasing the money supply, you start to get inflation. In fact, the way an economist would describe it is by increasing the money supply, what the Federal Reserve is doing in effect is taxing everyone's savings, because your savings now, due to inflation, start to become worth less than they were before.
Thanks. That's helpful.
So I know you were on a roll there, but I have some related context and maybe this will help sort of flesh out. So the debt in Canada this year is expected to reach 1.6 trillion. Just to give you a sense of the size of that, that is 115% of GDP, and up from 88% last year. So this is a massive expansion of debt. We have Canadian citizens carry the highest levels of debt in the G20 nations in the form of mortgages, I believe. Like property, personal property is leveraged more in Canada than the other G20 nations. And there was one other detail I wanted to add. Oh, the Bank of Canada, I don't think the relationship in this country is the same as the Federal Reserve Bank, but the Bank of Canada, of course, is printing $1 billion a day, like literally $5 billion a week.
Yep.
I wanted to ask you though about this. You talked about how on one side of the ledger is finance and the other side is production. Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Roughly speaking. And so on the side of production, this is what I really worry about in Canada is actually we appear to have a government very interested in and by the way, I'm using terms I've heard and I don't know the accuracy of the way I'm using these, like I'm a layman here, but we seem to have a government very interested in a command economy. So they've decided that specific aspects of our production in this country are no longer allowed to produce. Like they're putting the brakes on anything related to oil and gas. They're putting the brakes on mining in general, unless it has to do with precious metals for the purpose of batteries. So I'm not sure we have the same production capacity that we used to.
Yeah.
Should I be worried?
Yeah. Well, yeah, yes and no.
Okay.
You do have the same productive capacity. It's just not being utilized in the best possible way. The problem with command economy, and we have it to an extent here in the United States as well. Every time we say things like, well, the federal government should take over student lending, that's a push toward, it's a little bit more of a command economy. Anytime you have the government intruding itself like that in the economy, you get inefficiencies. And the inefficiencies arise mostly from the fact that you have politicians making decisions for people without the politicians, having enough information to be able to make those decisions well. Now, I give you a simple analogy. Suppose we're in a room of, let's say, 20 people, and you, David, are charged with ordering lunch for each of these 20 people. And you want to do the best job you possibly can in ordering lunch for these people. So what do? You go around, you start asking people, what allergies do you have? What foods do you like? Do you dislike? Are you allergic to any, gluten-free business, whatever it is? And you try your best to make the best decisions possible in ordering lunch for each of these 20 people. And are you going to get it right? In some cases you will. In other cases you'll get it wrong. But notice that's kind of a stupid way to go about doing it. A much better way to go about doing it is to lay out all the food we have available and say to people, come and help yourself. Take what it is you're interested in. And what happens there is the people will be able to make better decisions in choosing their lunches for them than you'll be able to make in choosing lunches for them. Why? Because they understand themselves, what their needs are, what their desires are, this sort of thing, far better than you do. Now, if it's difficult for one person to decide what sorts of lunches 20 people should have, imagine the problems involved with someone who's removed in some seat of power somewhere, making decisions not about lunch, but about things like healthcare or energy or whatever it is, not for 20 people, but for tens or hundreds of millions of people. And you can see the problem now. the people making the decision, no matter how smart they are, no matter how well-intentioned they are, they simply don't have enough information to be able to make decisions for people that are better than the people can make for themselves. And so what you get is you have all the productive capacity, you just aren't directing it into the best places that you could, because you've got someone making the decisions who doesn't know how to do this well.
That's a
Thanks.
helpful analogy. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
I feel like we've derailed to something. Maybe I might ask my question at an inopportune time, but so we're essentially printing money. You mentioned the money that we owe to the Social Security Trust Fund. That's an actual debt. That doesn't. We're not contemplating unfunded future liabilities.
Oh,
we haven't
right.
even talked about that yet.
Nothing we've talked about here includes unfunded liabilities.
So, so people are investing more in the United States, including domestically and from foreign investors, but not at the same rate that we are accumulating debt. The trust fund used to loan a lot of money to the American government. It's now needing some of that money back, so it's shrinking even faster. And the place that we are funding the trillion-dollar packages that are being, rolled out right now is essentially by printing that money and having the Federal Reserve invest directly. So back to your train of thought. What's wrong with that? What's the consequence?
Yeah, the problem with that is you get inflation, and the way to think about this is inflation, of course, is the growth in prices, and think of the average price level as the number of dollars, or let's say the money supply, divided by the production of goods and services. So if your production of goods and services is rising, let's say 2% every year, and your money supply is rising 2% every year, then your prices will be stable. Prices will just be the same, going along, doing what they're doing. You'll have zero inflation. The problem is when your money supply starts growing faster than the goods and services. And the way to think about this is as follows. Ask yourself, what is it that makes a dollar valuable, right? And I'll have students invariably still, all these decades later, someone's going to raise their hand and say, well, it's valuable because it's backed by gold. No, it's not backed by gold. It's not backed by anything, right? What makes a dollar valuable is the fact that you can walk into a store, put it on the counter, and the guy behind the counter will give you something. That's what makes the dollar valuable. The fact that people will give you goods and services in exchange for it. So once you understand that that's where the value of the dollar comes from, you can see quite clearly, if we print more and more dollars, all we're doing is taking the value of the goods and services we have and spreading them over a larger number of pieces of paper. It's like having a certain amount of peanut butter, but you've got a larger piece of bread, so you got to spread it more thinly. Each one of those dollars now is worth less than it was before. And the technical term we use for that is inflation. Inflation means that the dollars are worth less than they were. And the problem here, of course, is, it affects people in different ways. But people on fixed incomes are going to feel the pain of inflation most, because their incomes are this, and all of a sudden prices are going up. People who have lent money at some fixed interest rate, they're going to have a problem as well, because I loan you $1,000 and you agree to pay me $1,100 5 years in the future. Well, 5 years in the future comes and you hand me the 1,100, and it's worth a lot less than what I anticipated, because between then and now, inflation has eaten away its purchasing power. So the real problem here is when the Federal Reserve starts printing money, you get inflation, your dollars become worth less. It's identical. It is identical to the government stepping in and saying, we're going to tax everyone who holds dollar bills. You got $100 in your checking account, we're going to take 5% of it. You got $100 in your pocket, we're going to take 5% of that. Everybody who holds dollars gets taxed. Now, people will say in response, yeah, but we've been doing a lot of this money printing, most specifically during this COVID business, and I don't see prices going up. I don't see inflation. To which I respond, yes, you do. We just don't call it that. What's been happening, and you can see this if you delve into the into the details of the numbers. What's been happening is, as the Federal Reserve has been increasing the money supply, that money largely has been injected into financial markets, not into markets for goods and services. And so what we're getting is inflation in financial markets, not inflation in goods and services markets. Now, here's the thing. Inflation in financial markets, we don't call inflation. The official inflation numbers only look at prices of goods and services. Inflation in financial markets, we call by a different name. We call it a rising stock market. So what we've been seeing, actually, people have been asking this question. Look, we're in the midst of this pandemic, and a third of small businesses have gone out of business, and we've got record unemployment. How is it possible that the stock market has been going up? That's your inflation. It's been going up because the money the Federal Reserve has been printing has been going into those financial markets. Now, eventually, when things kind of calm down, people take a deep breath, they're going to say, okay, it's time to sell. They're going to sell. They're going to take that money. And what are you going to do with it? You're going to buy goods and services. And at that point, those dollars come flooding into the goods and services markets, and then you'll see it in the price tags of things in store shelves.
Mm-hmm.
So,
wow, I didn't realize this delayed effect, because of course, yeah, the stocks are going up like crazy. Tesla reached $750 today after market trading. You've been probably watching Bitcoin, $1,000 a day.
Oh, yeah.
So people are flooding their money into cryptocurrency as well. Is this to hedge against the inflation of fiat currencies?
I don't know. I mean, that might be behind some of the behavior that's going on. Some of it may be a bandwagon effect.
Sure.
That people, you see it going up, you want to get in. So I would imagine, given what's going on with the COVID lockdowns, a lot of it is due to risk aversion. People don't feel comfortable spending a lot of money right now. If I get any extra money, I'm going to sock it away somewhere. I'm going to hold it in financial markets.
Yeah, that is certainly happening. And by the way, the finance minister in Canada a month ago said that she called that, the phrase she used was preloaded stimulus.
Yeah.
So all these Canadians that are managing to save a little money have preloaded stimulus in their bank accounts.
So
I found that very weird.
So this is all well and fine, guys. But I'm a real person. I want to put austerity in the rearview mirror. I want to round up the Antony Davies and keep them quiet on an island somewhere, and I want my universal basic income. I want single payer health care. I want some stability. And you keep yammering on about inflation. I don't care if a loaf of bread costs $100 as long as I'm receiving my $15,000 a month check from the government. And it's going to hurt the fat cats who lent money. It's going to hurt grandma and grandpa on their fixed income. But you know what? We can fix that with stimulus too. We can ensure that grandma and grandpa have plenty of money in retirement, and let's increase Social Security. And if we can print the money and get it and spend it and make everybody happy, then what's the problem, Antony?
Yeah. Well, the problem is that you end up chasing your tail of saying, look, I don't care about the inflation, just give me UBI and print the money if you have to. Okay, fine. So we print the money, everybody gets, $15,000 UBI. And because of that, we get inflation. And because of the inflation next year, $15,000 won't cut it. I need 17,000. Okay, well, we'll print more. But then that gives you more inflation, which means the year after that, you need to print more. So you start chasing your tail like this. But that's the lesser of the problems. The greater problem is you have created an environment of tremendous financial uncertainty. I, as an investor, am not sure what's going to be happening with my investments because of all of this money printing and inflation that's going on. And so I will be more reticent than I would be otherwise to look at long-term investments. If I'm thinking about, for example, investing in some business, it's going to be a 10, 15 year, 20 year payoff. I don't know that I'm willing to take on the risk of having my money tied up for 10, 15, 20 years, because who knows what's going to be happening with inflation. Today it's UBI, tomorrow it's going to be forgiving student loan debt, and then it's going to be bolstering Social Security. And so I, as an investor, am reticent to commit my finances long term to investment projects. That comes back and hits the rest of us in the form of less jobs, less technological development. Where do jobs come from? They come from entrepreneurs and investors getting together. The entrepreneur has an idea, the investor puts in the money, the business is founded, it grows as it starts to become profitable and successful. It hires people. Now you get jobs, and those people go out and buy stuff. That creates more jobs. All of that dynamic starts with two ingredients: the investor who has the idea, the entrepreneur who has the idea, and the investor who has the money that he's willing to put in. And when we exist in this high, uncertain inflation environment, we make it very scary for the investor to put his money in. And so the economy then starts to grind to a halt. And that phenomenon I said at the beginning was a financial thing. It didn't live in the goods and services market. All of a sudden, it jumps into the goods and services market. And this problem we've created in the financial sector starts to have real effects on the rest of us.
So
go ahead, Steve.
Sorry, just to follow up, I don't want to sound like a Facebook meme or jump on a bandwagon. I'd really like to know how you feel about this. If you believe there's an exodus happening from California right now to Utah, to Arizona, to Texas, are we seeing a microcosm of potentially what could happen nationally, and investors and entrepreneurs fleeing the country altogether if it were to get to such a situation of uncertainty that they're like, I think I'm better off, learning Mandarin and going and taking my chances over there?
Long term, yes. Short term, no. And here's why. No matter how bad our problems are here in the US, we are the most handsome guy at the ugly guy dance. And so, you can flee California and go to Utah, Nevada, Texas. You really can't flee the United States. I mean, you can flee, but where are you going to go? Because despite our problems, this is still pretty much, give or take, the best place in the world currently to be investing. Now, if China continues as it's been doing over the past 30, 40, 50 years, adopting more and more market freedoms, and if they start to move that into the political sphere and start to introduce more political freedoms, all of a sudden China might become, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it might happen in 20, 30, 40 years, it becomes the place to be. And then people will be leaving the US like they're leaving California.
So,
go on.
Go ahead, Dave. Yeah.
Well, okay, so I think this is related to my earlier sort of more fundamental question about policy lurch. Okay, so Antony, you're talking about this pattern of entrepreneurship and ownership, company ownership, as one of the mechanisms that holds the current market in place. But then you're talking about China, and I actually don't know enough about their, sort of on the ground day-to-day policies. But my understanding is that the communist history there means property ownership is let's say, less favorable. Maybe there are restrictions or other kinds of constraints on property ownership. It's more expensive to own property, or you're paying more taxes on it and such. And okay, so here's what I'm setting up. At what point do we hit a sort of policy, fence, and we fall over to the other side of the fence where entrepreneurship and company ownership is really no longer allowed, but actually the means of production is collectively owned, communally owned? Like, where do we have systems in North America that are resilient enough to withstand that? Or is this an irrational fear I have?
Well, let me change it a little bit. I think I don't want to call it irrational. I think it's less likely than what I'm about to tell you. We don't have a history here of government ownership of the means of production. And as much as we have minority of socialists in this country who talk about that, really, if you dig down and ask them, okay, what specific policies are you interested in? They themselves who are self-proclaimed socialists aren't interested in the government owning the means of production. What we have been kind of tripping into in this country over the past half century is what my colleague James Harrigan and I call transferism. It's not socialism, it's not capitalism, but rather transferism is a system in which the means of production are privately owned. So it looks like capitalism, except that the government comes along and it takes money from one group of people and transfers it to another. And if you think about our federal government today, of every dollar our federal government spends, roughly 70 cents, so 70% of it, is simply the government taking money from one group of people and giving it to another. Only 30% is actual governance. And so as we talk about things like UBI and forgiving student loan debt or single-payer healthcare, it's more of the same thing. It's the private sector will be handling the production of the goods and services. But once those goods and services are produced, the government's going to step in and say, okay, you give me some of that, and we're going to give it to these people over here.
Thank you. That's actually among the clearest explanations I've heard. Steve, just before we leave this topic here, so Steve and I both, grew up in Canada. In Canada, we do have this concept called Crown Corporation, which is, I think, as close as we get to public ownership of the means of production. So Saskatchewan, the province where we grew up, it was the first place where single-payer healthcare was installed. But also in that same province, it's the crown corporations that manage energy, telecommunications, all of your insurance, your water, your utilities, electricity, and then of course the standards like police and first responders and that sort of thing. So we talk a lot in Canada. There's this policy debate always between privatization and crown ownership. I presume that same debate doesn't happen in the U.S., does it?
No, very rarely.
So when you talked about, Antony, 70% of the dollars that the government takes in the form of taxation is being transferred, you're not talking about, I mean, somebody might say, well, like when the government takes my money and then goes and buys airplanes, that goes to the investors or the shareholders at Boeing or whatever. You're not talking about that. You're simply talking about they've literally taken my money and put it directly into the hands of a different citizen in the form of some kind of social program or a stimulus
even less than that. It's not necessarily in the form of a social program, although there are a number of social programs fall under this heading. But picture Social Security, for example. Social Security is exactly that. The government is taking 12.4% of current workers' paychecks and with one hand and handing it out to retirees with the other. Medicare, similar, although the government isn't giving the Medicare recipients cash, it's allowing them to go get medical care, and the government will pay for that through the Medicare system. But it's the same kind of idea that the goods are being produced privately. What's happening is the government is taking money from this group, giving it to that group, and saying, go ahead and buy what you need.
This concept of transferism, is this covered well in your book? I know that you and Mr. Harrigan, Dr. Harrigan?
Dr. Harrigan, yeah.
Could you please just share with us, if we're looking for more information about that, because that's the first I've heard this term, and I think it's apt. So where can I find more?
Yeah, you can look through our book, Cooperation and Coercion, and we talk about it in several places there. And the whole premise behind cooperation and coercion, we mentioned, I'll just tell you, it's human beings. If you look at everything that we do as groups, anything is non-solitary. We always organize ourselves in one of two ways. It doesn't matter what country you're from, what point in history. We always organize ourselves in one of two ways, either via principles of cooperation or via principles of coercion. That is, we either get together voluntarily and decide, okay, we're going to do something, and if it works out, that's great. If it doesn't work out, I'm going to walk away and go do something else. Or we organize coercively. That is, we appoint somebody, and this person's going to tell us what we're going to do, and there's force behind it. You got to do what this person says. And the premise of this book, and transferism plays a role here, is to ask the question, under what circumstances is one set of guiding principles, organizing principles, better than the other?
Okay.
And that's the eternal question. I mean, in some ways, that's the two-party system that we have here. You could say that the Democrats, by and large, would be more in favor of coercion, and not in the sense of has necessarily a negative connotation, but more in the sense of I would rather not trust every other person in my country to do their share, to voluntarily do what's right, to kind of push back from the table when they feel like they've made enough money, et cetera. I want the government involved to some extent to collect a little cream off the top and help me with certainly first responding services, the national security, and the further you go to the left of that political spectrum, perhaps then you're talking about other types of things. And until you get to the point where Canada is, where insurance, energy, so many sectors are completely controlled by the government, and all of the people working in those sectors are government employees.
Yeah.
Because I want to. Sorry, I'm going to jump in for a minute, but I'm a recovering leftist, let's say, and I'm going to say to Steve that you've got that just backwards. You've got it completely opposite. In fact, government is a way of electing our peers into a House of Commons so that they can help us all to cooperate. And actually, the coercion comes from these powerful CEOs and chairpersons of the boards who coerce their employees, and that's the oppressive group. But this is the cooperative government that we have. In fact, the New Democratic Party, at the time it was the CCF in Saskatchewan, they actually created a type of corporation called cooperatives so that it could be collectively owned. And so, Anthony, am I veering away from economics here? Or
no,
Steve and I are right? Which one of us is right?
I think you're both wrong.
Good.
Oh, good.
In interestingly different ways. Steve started off by saying that the implying that the Democrats were more interested in coercive forms of organization, where the Republicans are more interested in cooperative. And I disagree with that. I think they vary. When it comes to economic questions, generally, the Democrats tend to favor coercion more than do the Republicans. However, over the past 30 or 40 years, Republicans have kind of come to terms with using coercion also. When it comes to social issues, they tend to flip. The Democrats tend to be more interested in using cooperative forms of organization, whereas the Republicans tend to be more interested in coercive. And so I think neither party gets it right, because the right split of using cooperation versus coercion is not the economic sphere versus the social sphere. Rather, it boils down to very clear things that we can talk about in economics. And you raised the point, David, when you talked about businesses using coercive force. A business that, for example, co-opts a politician to get favorable treatment, or regulations that keep out competition, or regulations that prevent unions from forming, or whatever it is, that corporation is indeed employing coercive techniques via the government, and that's a misuse of government.
Oh, by the way,
Conversely,
for any Canadians that might be watching this right now, Antony has just described the We Charity. Go ahead.
I don't know what We Charity is.
Oh,
But
they paid the Prime Minister's family $500,000 in the form of various speaking engagements, and in return, they got a $1 billion contract from our Liberal government
yeah,
in this
yeah,
COVID pandemic.
yeah. So co-opting the government in that way clearly is a misuse of coercive power. But then you can misuse coercive power in the opposite direction. If we don't have enough regulations to prevent corporations from dumping pollutants into the rivers or spewing, greenhouse gases into the air or whatever it is, there again we have a problem. But the problem isn't too much coercion; it's not enough. And if you start to think of it in this way, you can see that there's an interesting. It doesn't clearly delineate every case, but I think it delineates probably 90% plus of the cases. And that is, if you have an instance in which someone is imposing harm on someone else, that is a good and proper place to be using coercive force. That is to prevent people from imposing harm on each other. But if you have a situation in which someone is not imposing harm on someone else, that is not a place to be using coercive force. That's a place to allow people to organize via cooperative means.
I enjoyed listening to your perspective. I think I believe it was James on one of the podcasts I listened to, and you can correct me if I'm mischaracterizing what he said, but he made a statement that I thought was really brilliant about our society today. And he said, if you take 8 or 12 polarizing political topics and ask have me write down what my kind of my slant or my opinion is on all of those topics, and tell me what you chose or what your political slant was on one of them, I can predict with a great degree of accuracy where you fall on the other dozen. Versus
Right.
40 years ago, where it would be pretty common to have to ask me my opinion on every single one. It wouldn't
Right.
be a matter of, well, I'm over here or I'm over there. It's well, on this particular thing, because of my life experience and maybe my job, my perspective, I really fall here. But on these other topics, I lean more this way. And we've gone away from that, or I think we've seen a deeper polarization. What does that mean for economics?
Yeah, I think we have. And this comes to something David said that I meant to jump on, which is David described us as a society getting together and electing somebody to do some things. And he described that as a voluntary, as a cooperative kind of activity. And I think that's incorrect, and it ties into what you just said. I think we've ended up in this space now because we have come to erroneously equate government with society. Government and society are not the same thing. Government is a tool that society uses, just like markets are a tool that society uses. So when we come together as a people and say, for example, we need to do something to help low-income workers. When we say we need to do something, that does not imply government needs to do it. Government's a tool. What we need to then do is ask the question, which of these two tools, market or government, is better suited to achieving the ends that we need here, and using the appropriate tool for the appropriate problem. We've gotten away from that. And I think that, Steve, has caused what you're describing, that if you can tell me where you stand on one issue, I can predict where you stand on everything.
Is there a way to walk society back? I maybe more specifically, my question is, I asked you before, does the debt matter? Now I'm asking you, does this conversation matter? Is it important? I mean, can we educate and persuade and conversate our way back to a less polarized society?
Yes, this conversation matters because it ends up being the key to the question: does the United States persist over the next century? And it all begins with people on the left and the right recognizing that though they may disagree on specific policies, they both have the same goal in mind. The people on the left are not malicious. The people on the right are not stupid. They're malicious and stupid people on both sides, and they're brilliant and altruistic people on both sides. We're all the same kind of human being in that respect. So when people on the left say things like government should do more to help the poor, and people on the right say government should do less to help the poor, they're both saying the same thing. They're both saying we need to do more to help the poor. The apparent disconnect is that people on the left tend to regard government as a complement to society. So when they say we need to help the poor, of course they mean government. And people on the right tend to see government as a substitute for society. So when they say the government needs to do less to help the poor, what they mean is get out of the way. You're preventing us from helping the poor.
That is absolutely true in my, sorry, I don't mean that that's true. I mean that matches how I how I've come to perceive this policy lurch that I'm talking about. Like Canadians are paying more and more tax, particularly under this government. This government is currently raising taxes again, even amidst the pandemic. They're looking at even taxing home equity, which is something I didn't think I would see from a Canadian government in my lifetime. So it clearly appears to me that this government expects, and many of the citizens expect, that government is the fixer of said problems. They're really. I should actually mention the former leader of Canada's opposition party. His name is Andrew Scheer. After he stepped out of the role, he said something in an interview that really struck me, and that is that there really hasn't been, for the past 30 or 40 years, a reason for, and conservatives haven't put forward very good arguments for society's biggest problems. And it's time, he would say, it's time for conservatives to do that. Because there is a place for the market, and there is a place for government to get out of the way, and there's a time for that. I wonder, Antony, are we, like, how do we get out of this debt load? How do we get out of this pandemic mode, given we seem to have governments in North America absolutely stepping in to try and fix everything and provide solutions and constrain more natural market forces?
Yeah, and I want to push back a little bit on what you just said. You said, I'll paraphrase it, governments are trying to fix these problems. I would rephrase it as
Sure.
as governments are trying to appear to fix these problems.
Okay.
Whether they actually fix them or not is actually of secondary importance. What's of primary importance is that the people perceive that they are attempting to fix them, because that's what's necessary for the politician to get elected, and that's ultimately the politician's goal. I think the place to start, it's a very difficult place, is that the voters themselves have to stop asking for stuff. Because so long as we ask for things, give me free education, give me, free healthcare, whatever it is, so long as we keep asking for things, we give politicians an incentive to deliver them. Because if you and I are running for office and I know that we don't have the money to do this, and it would be actually bad for the economy if I started handing out all this stuff, I have an incentive nonetheless to promise these people whatever it is they want. Because if I don't, they'll elect you and you'll give it to them anyway. So, I might be giving them the stuff that I think they shouldn't be having, but at least I'll be elected. And so notice all the politicians have an incentive to respond to the people, to give them what they're looking for. Our problem is we keep asking for more and more. We have asked for so much that for the past several decades, Our federal government in this country has been about 6 years too big. By that I mean, at any given point in time, our federal government is of a size that that our economy will be able to support only 6 years in the future. And the government we had 6 years ago, that government was big enough that we could afford to support it today. Constantly, we have this government that's always too big and getting bigger because people are asking for stuff and politicians have an incentive to deliver.
I wonder if there's a chicken and egg problem here and relate to, and by the way, again, I don't know this history very well, but John Locke apparently found or felt that property ownership was key. And I feel there's a relationship here between asking for something or having the wherewithal and drive to just produce something. And it seems to me property ownership is key to that. Am I right there?
Property ownership is key. And I want to be careful in saying that because people, particularly my friends on the left, will hear that and say, well, what he means, that's just selfishness. He just wants stuff for himself. And that's not what property rights mean. Property rights mean that, there's something I produced, I own it, which means I am now legally entitled to do with it what I want. Now, if I'm a selfish person, I'm just going to hang on to it. If I'm an altruistic person, I'm going to want to give it to other people. And most people, if you look at the numbers, are actually more altruistic than they are selfish. And so in a weird sense, you can't have charity if you don't have property rights because I can't give away what I don't own.
You made a statement a few minutes ago. You said that government isn't trying to solve the problem. They're trying to appear that they are solving the problem. And that some people may think that sounds anti-government. That's coming from you. That's not an anti-government statement, right? That is a clarification of government as a tool statement.
It's simply a behavioral statement that these are human beings, that the same human beings that populate the private sector also populate the public sector. It's how human beings behave. If you tell the person that he gets to be in this office if he attracts X number of votes, you've immediately given him incentive to deliver to the voters whatever it is the voters want, because that's the only way to get into office.
I had another question in mind.
Go ahead.
But
I'll throw in.
Please go ahead,
Anthony. I'll throw in one more thing here, which is notice something else. This behavior extends. It's not just to the politicians, but to people who work in government. Because if I'm a bureaucrat in government, the budget that accrues to me is a function of the problem that I'm designed to address. So long as that problem remains or even gets bigger, my budget will remain or even get bigger. So I have this perverse incentive. I'm not saying that everybody in government is looking to perpetuate problems. I am saying that a direct incentive exists for them to do that. And it's going to take a great deal of character to push back on that.
I want to be respectful of your time, Antony. I think we asked you for 45 minutes, and here we are an hour into the conversation, and I want to carry on, but I'm actually running low on new questions to ask you. Maybe this question for you is there something that Steve and I that you'd rather we asked you, or that is something you think is a very important concern or question that people should be asking today?
Well, Steve started off by asking me to tell horror stories. And I haven't given you my horror story yet, and that is that the federal government in the United States has passed some time ago a point of no return. It is not possible for it to make good on the promises that it's made. And here Steve was talking about unfunded obligations, financial promises we made to current and future retirees. We simply don't have the money. We won't have the money to make good on that. And what that means is that ultimately the federal government is going to bump up against the laws of mathematics, that simply it cannot continue the way it is. When that happens, and I don't think it's too far off, I've said over the past decade that it's 10 or 20 years off. I still think it's 10 or 20 years off, but now the Social Security Trust Fund kind of agrees with that. They're reporting that Social Security will be bankrupt within 15 years. When that happens, there's good news and bad news. And the bad news is the federal government as we know it now will cease to exist as we know it now. The good news is I believe the federal government will return to the form that was intended at the founding, which is a limited body that does 8 specific things. They're listed in Article 1 of the Constitution, and everything else is left to the states. If you want UBI, fine. If you want Social Security, fine. If you want to forgive student loans, fine. But you'll do it on a state-by-state basis. Pennsylvania might do it, California might not. Utah might do something different. And the fun part there is we'll all learn from each other. And Pennsylvania, if it makes a bad decision, can look at Utah and say, what did they do? Because things are working out well there. Let's duplicate it here. We don't have those alternate scenarios to look at now because in a perverse way, we understand the evils of monopoly in markets and we fail to transfer that to the federal government. The federal government is a monopoly of governance. If we governed at the state level, we'd have 50 states in competition and all of the wondrous forces of competition in the marketplace that bring out new things and innovations and lower prices and all of that would be at play, albeit a little more rustily, but would be at play in the political sphere if we governed more at the state level.
I hear you. You know, I used to, so there's a province in Canada called Quebec that has been a separatist, there's been a separatist faction there for a long time, which I used to think was crazy. And now I think, yeah, there's a place for that. And we're seeing some of that sentiment out west as well, in Alberta in particular, but in Saskatchewan. In fact, Saskatchewan has a political party called the Buffalo Party that I think was in the most recent election was third in line. You know, they had more votes than even our Liberal government, and more votes than the Green Party of the province as well. Okay, but there's a question here I wanted to ask you in relation. So 10 or 15 years from now, the United States federal government comes up against this wall, and as you say, and what if by that time Canada has spent itself silly and has had to give up sovereign control of our Arctic passage, which I hear is a pretty powerful economic force, and whoever then controls the Arctic passage, whether it's maybe Russia or China or Denmark or whoever, they just walk up and start buying the states. Like, is that a possible scenario? Is that even feasible?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Like, what if they want to buy Alaska and we're going to bail out your debt? We're just going to take Alaska.
Right. Yeah. My knee-jerk reaction, without having done the math, is that Alaska wouldn't fetch enough money. And I tell you this because I did run these numbers. I asked the question, what would happen if the federal government sold off all of its assets? All of its assets, the buildings, all the federal land it owns all over the place, the gold in Fort Knox or New York, wherever it is, sold off all the assets. Well, all the federal government's assets all combined are worth around $3 trillion. Three. Yes. Wow. It just crosses the 10% mark of what the federal government owes.
Yeah. Holy mac. Wow.
Well, Andy, I'm going to ask you one more thing, and maybe we can let you go. This is, I don't know if the word is esoteric, or it's a very strange question, but it's a personal question. So I've felt, especially if you spend time on social media, but in lots of social circles, that the answer is always a pitchfork and a torch. And the only thing I need to figure out is, what am I burning down? Who am I stabbing? And I listened to your podcast. And even in the midst of this conversation, I can see in ways in which you've set your pitchfork down. You've extinguished the torch, and you're you're marching forward in a different way. You're teaching in a different way. You're trying to have an impact in a different way. Can you share with us what you've done over the last years or decades or whatever to do that? Are there some real life examples that others may be able to emulate and say, this is how you've chose to wade out into the pool of society?
Yeah, I'll give you two things. The first is an accident. The second is a little more deliberate. And the accident is I was born into a place where I have lots of very close friends on the left and on the right. And close friends, I love these people. And so when the guy on the right says we need to stop with the minimum wage and the guy on the left says we need to do more of the minimum wage, I understand what they're both saying because I haven't turned off either one of their friends of mine, right? So and that's just a happy accident. The deliberate part is taking that and extending it to everyone else, and deliberately, and I try to do this as best as possible on social media, and you can imagine the problem, is to love the person I'm talking to. That it's not just some faceless text on a screen. There's someone back there who has concerns, and rather than take the attitude of I'm going to take what's in my brain and drill it into yours, rather take the attitude of show me what's in your heart, and I'll help you find the best way to play this out in a way that can help other people. I think, does it work every time? No, it doesn't. But at the very least, it makes me be able to interact on social media without, getting a headache.
Antony, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for your generosity and time and in conversation with us today. Can we invite you back sometime?
Absolutely, I'd be happy. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and if you guys can get along, we'd even love to have James tag along, and we could chat too.
James is a hoot.
Okay,
Well,
so
thank you very
Antony,
much.
yeah, Antony,
yeah,
this is how it works. Oh, sorry, Steve, I cut you off.
No, but
Okay, so Antony, this is how it works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say goodnight to you, and we're going to take you off screen. Just so you know, technologically, we're going to still hear you, and so will our audience. So what I recommend is that you mute and then feel free to just exit and leave our meeting. Steve and I are going to just carry on a little bit of conversation as we reflect a little bit on our conversation that we've had with you. But I am honored that you would spend some time with us in this conversation. By the way, for anyone watching, Dr. Davies has, of course, the book that we've mentioned. He's co-authored that, and the website. So there's a link below the video here to find more information about Antony Davies at the FEE, and also there's a link to the book if you want to check that out. Dr. Davies, just thank you so much, and have a really good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Appreciate it.
Steve, I'm really glad that you reached out to Antony, and that he agreed to join us. This has been really cool. I've learned a ton. I'm going to re-watch this video probably a couple of times because he brought up some examples and some theory that I want to learn more about. This concept of transferism, for example. I hadn't heard that before, and I want to learn more about that. It's been great.
I can't recommend cooperation and coercion strongly enough. I mean, they do a brilliant job of breaking down economics. Really, I mean, it's definitely leans more towards the American economy and deals with the U.S. economy, but the same sorts of principles apply to basically any economy, any country, especially to Canada. I mean, as much as we are different, between the U.S. and Canada, we're very similar in how we do things and look at things. And it just what I love about how he thinks is I just thought he summed it up brilliantly. It's not about some territorial, I need to prove this, I need to make this argument, but this almost innocent way of just diving into the data and saying the one thing that I do believe is that incentive matters. And so what can we determine about the incentives in this situation? You know, and what's driving people? What's causing them to make the decisions that they're making? And and when you could start thinking that way, and you could start to have some better conversations. You could start to really stick to the tenets that that we espouse at the beginning of every podcast. You know, you don't need to win every argument. You don't need to try. It's okay to change your mind, and it's okay to respect people that even that vehemently disagree with you. You know, that passionately just completely feel polar opposite about a certain issue. Like he said, he loves those people. Those are some of his best friends, and it's still important to have the conversation. I felt encouraged. I feel discouraged in some cases, but that conversation really encouraged me that exactly what we're doing is exactly what needs to be done.
Yeah, so there was this other point he brought up, that government is a tool for society to use, like the market is a tool for society to use. I hadn't thought of it that way, and just the way he summed that up so concisely, it makes great sense. It makes me think of, and he went further to say that there's, well, he didn't use the word problem, but I will, that there may be a problem thinking that society and government are somehow synonymous. But I wonder how that now changes the way I reflect on or think about representation in government. For example, Canada a few years ago was pondering some sort of electoral reform toward proportional representation in government, as opposed to our first past the post system. Is that proportional representation model more of that synonymous behavior? You know, where government becomes sort of a microcosm of society, and is that good for future or not? Like, he's made me think about a lot of these issues very differently than I had.
I think it's kind of liberating to think of, you know, rather than this de facto idea that I think is developed. I think he's right, over the last 40 or 50 years of society is government, and therefore when I'm voting for a certain office, when I'm voting for representation, I'm making a statement, or I'm making a vote for how I want the world to be, the way I want society to function, the way I want people to act, the values that I want people to hold, the principles that I want people to adhere to. And that's not what government is meant to be if you look at it from that perspective. You've got tools in society. Government is a tool. The market system is a tool. I would add religion, churches are tools. Charities are tools. You know, these are all things that we can, civic organizations, these are things that we can choose to get involved in, to throw our energy, our money, our resources into, if we feel that in our community, or because of our particular desires, you know, to express ourselves into the world, that this is where it would make most sense to put our energy. And when you look at it from that perspective, all of a sudden, you know, voting and working in government and working with government, it's more of a job interview process. It's like, okay, well, I need you to accomplish something for me in this government sector, and I feel like you've got a good personality and it represents how I would go in there and hone that tool or apply that tool.
What was the phrase he used here? What did he say? People need to stop asking government for stuff. Yeah, I forget precisely what he said, but that's the gist of it. And that reminds me of what Brian Hyde was talking about with us, as he spoke of, like, just like you're mentioning here, if we act locally and exert our energy toward these mechanisms in society that we think are valuable and useful and help form the kind of environment we want for our future, then that's maybe the best approach. Like we act locally and exert that effort rather than just ask for the government tool to fix everything or provide those things.
Maybe it's a simple function of the population size, and as the population grows, something like a federal central government becomes so ethereal and just so removed from your everyday life.
But also the silver bullet.
Yeah, you start to think of it differently. Like if you were to say, you know what, remind me the town that you live in, London.
Yeah, London.
London. So if you were to say, how many people are in London?
500,000.
So 500,000 people. That's a lot more manageable to wrap your head around. So if you were to say, if a politician was to come out and say, you know what, I believe that everybody in London, Ontario ought to get a universal basic income of $4,000 a month. Everybody, regardless of what they do, that's just kind of their base, and that's what we provide to everybody. The caveat is no federal money. We're going to do this. I mean, we've got 500,000 people here, and we can certainly manage this and put this together inside of London, Ontario, and we will be a beacon to the rest of the world, and we'll show them how it works.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, the real rubber hit the road kind of potential issues and problems, and how are we going to put that together, and where is that burden going to fall, and who's going to pay for that. All of a sudden you're talking about your neighbors, businesses that you frequent, politicians that you may know or voted for. I mean, all of a sudden it's a much different idea, and it's like, well, if you can't figure it out as a group of 500,000 people, how is the group of 35 million going to do it any more efficiently or easily? Other than to
we're just going to take it from Alberta in the form of transfer payments, equalization payments.
Alberta can afford it.
That's the answer. That's the Canadian answer to. It's much easier to do it as 35 million instead of 500,000. We just have equalization payments.
But it's interesting.
There was a question that came up. I was thinking to ask him, but our time was getting long. Remember you and I a couple of months ago now, we were imagining a scenario where it would be illegal for a government to have debt or carry a deficit, specifically was what we were talking about. And it would have been fun, I think, to hear Antony just riff on that, and he kind of did. There was a moment where, I forget the context, but it'll come to me. Maybe I'll bring it up in the next conversation we have.
And it's interesting. He talked about perpetually being 6 years, our appetite being 6 years ahead of our ability to pay for it. And that doesn't, when you put it that way, it doesn't sound that bad. It's like, so we could just shave 8 or 10% off of our spending and actually reverse this cycle, and even some glorious day in the future potentially extinguish the national debt. I mean,
no. I don't think. Okay, extinguishing the national debt. Didn't he say that that's now quite impossible?
So in Canada, or in the United States, that is impossible because of the unfunded obligations. And unfunded obligations means the trust fund, right? So we had baby boomers.
Yeah.
Baby boomers moved through the working age, from 30 to 60.
Yeah, and they paid into
billions and trillions of dollars into the Social Security system. And the Social Security system set up in the 30s, that was a huge boon for the Social Security system. I mean, you have very few retirees. People weren't living as long 30, 40 years ago, and you had a massive workforce, and you had a huge surge in productivity, which means the taxes they were able to pull off of all of that labor and productivity was huge, massive, and they built up this giant trust fund. And some of the actuaries started to say, it's a ways off, but 40, 50 years from now, in the early 21st century, we could start, because people seem to be living longer. These baby boomers are all going to retire. They're going to want to start taking this money back out that they were promised. That's the reason we took it from them in the first place. And we're going to have a problem. So we're going to create this trust fund. We'll invest it. We'll make earnings off the investments. We'll continue to tax the workforce. And I think we can manage our way through it. And then in 1980, Ronald Reagan made the statement, we've got a sword of Damocles, just slowly coming down. And they made some relatively minor tweaks. Honestly, it was, okay, if you're 30 right now, starting in the year 2000, you won't be able to retire at 65. You will have to wait until you're 67.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't tell people that we're turning 65 next year. Sorry, you've got to wait 3 more years. They told people who were retiring 30 years from now, in order to relieve some of the pressure on that system, we're going to make these minor adjustments. And they made another fairly big adjustment in about 5 or 6 years ago, where there was a method for spouses to kind of double dip the system to really, not really anything illegal, but they could take full advantage of the system by a spouse taking their Social Security and letting the other spouse's Social Security build up in certain ways. And they called that a loophole. Some people called it a loophole. Some people called it a tax strategy, whatever. But the government closed it and said, we're not going to allow you to do that anymore. And that put several $billion back in the coffers. And to the extent that, like he had mentioned, there was such a big Social Security nest egg, a trust fund, that they were actually able to lend a few $1 trillion to the federal government as an investment. It's like, well, there's nothing better than buying U.S. government-backed securities, so we'll lend that money to the U.S. government. When we need it back 30 years from now, we'll get it, and we'll make some interest in the meantime. That's a good deal for everybody. Yeah. Now they need it, and as people are living longer, actuarially, it just doesn't work anymore. It's going to fall in on itself. And the best thing we could do is be proactive. They should be telling people who are 30, 35 years old right now, listen, in 10 years, we are going to stop taking that tax out of your paycheck. Also, you're not going to get anything when you retire. Sorry. But you've got 30, 40 years to reinvest that 12% that we've been taking from you and figure out a different way to handle your finances in retirement. And big slices like that would allow us to continue to take care of the people who are already counting on it, who already put into the system for their whole working career, let them live out their retirements, and just give 2 or 3 decades for younger people to reorient themselves. And even that doesn't sound like the end of the world, but if we keep treating it as the third rail of American politics, and you can't talk about Social Security, and you can't, because immediately somebody starts to suggest some common sense solution or common sense discussion like that, and immediately every opponent they have will say, he's trying to take away your grandmother's paycheck. How is she going to live? How is she going to pay for her medication? She's 85 years old. No one's ever suggested that. No one's ever said that's a good idea. They've just said, we got to do something, or we'll just run into a brick wall. 30, 40 years from now or whatever, we'll keep band-aiding it, and finally it will just disappear. And along with that goes the faith that the American government can deliver on its promises. And all of a sudden, like Antony talked about, we maybe get stripped down to a government that can only afford to tax and do technically what the Constitution says it should do, and everything else defaults to the states. And
So
and
that kind of contraction, though, can't possibly be pleasant. Like,
No,
what you're talking about here is a really good, very concrete example of how we're borrowing from our future. This is a concept I think like right now our federal government is printing money and spending like an addict, and what's actually happening is they're spending my daughter's lifelong taxes and maybe my grandchildren, and we're spending future generations' productivity today. And you've just laid out precisely how that works in very concrete terms. It's that today there are people entering the workforce who won't have the Canada Pension Plan when they turn 65. Or because Canada has done some of those tweaks as well, changing the retirement age, and so far they've been able to stave off any real criticisms. Okay, I think, or at least as a layman Canadian citizen, I'm not told that we're going to run out of money, but I am also aware that Quebec will just not trust our federal government with management of the Quebec pension. Alberta wants to pull out of the Canada Pension Plan and manage that more locally as well. And this again reminds me how naive I think how naive I was about the relationship between federal and provincial dynamics.
And the nice
I was
thing
happy,
about
by the
these-
way. Sorry, I was happy that Anthony, touched on that, and that's more that I want to learn about, because he touched on this idea that if there is a significant contraction in the federal government and its mandate, it leaves then the states to each independently serve their citizens, and it never
And then
occurred to me that that's actually the intent of the United States, because I've grown up in an environment where the federal government is kind of the what do you say? It's abstract and sort of ethereal, but it's also the magic bullet.
Yep. It's and in a situation like that, people can start voting with their feet more and more. It's like
Well,
wow,
like this exodus that you talked about.
Alberta seems like a great place to live. I think I'm going to pull up stakes and move to Alberta.
Yeah.
And if too many people move to Alberta, then the people, well, first of all, everybody empties out of a state or out of a province, and half the population of Ontario moves to Alberta. Well, that's a great boon for Alberta, and a terrible loss and an economic hardship
how many people,
for Ontario. However, at some point, that giant movement is going to create opportunities and interesting economic opportunities in Ontario, and including they can start to mimic some of the things that Alberta might be doing or whatever.
How many people do you know our age that left Saskatchewan for Alberta to find work?
I moved probably a little before I saw a lot of that. Most of my close friends are actually still in the town where we grew up, haven't left.
Yeah.
Most of the people I know.
Okay. Both of my siblings and myself, actually, for a few years, 5.5 years, I was in Alberta. Both of my siblings are in Alberta. My uncle's in Alberta.
Well, I'm sorry, my sister's in Alberta. I guess
your sister's in Alberta.
Yep.
So out of, let's say, a circle of friends, 40 or 50 strong, there's a dozen or 15 that left after high school. And that's the exodus that we're seeing in California to Texas, or California to Arizona. And that exodus happened because Saskatchewan's policies at the time was not inviting new business and new investment, just as Antony described, and because investors were hesitant, or reticent was his phrase, whereas Alberta was open for business. Now, Alberta currently is desperately ready to open for business, but is hamstrung by various other policies at the federal level, and it's really causing. I think it's causing a national crisis, frankly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When people don't like the exodus
Ontarians don't
that we
understand
talk
that.
about,
Like,
and
the
yeah,
Easterners don't generally get it. They probably, if anyone that I work with hears me say what I just said, they think I'm crazy. It's like, well, this is Canada. Why would a province want to leave?
right,
Well,
right. And I mean, I don't. People leave for their own economic reasons. That's why I like economics so much, and somebody like Antony who really drills down into the incentives, like good or bad. I'm not making. He's not in so many ways. I'm not sure he made a single value judgment in anything that he said. It was simply
I tried to trap them, in
observations.
fact, and
Here's the incentives. You can't really blame somebody for doing that when you set up when it's set up that way, and that's what they're incentivized to do. That's what they're going to do. And so, yeah, people aren't like, we've got tons of the people from California moving into my community, and as you talk to them, and they're not moving. I mean, I guess there's some sentiment of like, we just got tired of it or whatever, but they're individual stories. I was in a community, and the crime got so bad, and I couldn't leave my car open at night, and or I couldn't even locked. It was just going to get broken into and vandalized, and my home got vandalized, and I was worried about my kids walking to school, and we just wanted to move to a smaller place. And as we looked around California, we didn't see a better option, and that's why we're here. Yeah. Or people move because of economic situations, or I can sell my house for $900,000 here. I can move to Steve's neighborhood and buy a house twice the size for $400,000, and that sounds pretty good, and so, but if the incentives are there, then you have these lots of people following that same trail of incentives. It's not that people are like, I just don't like what my government's doing, and as a protest, I'm going to pull my kids out of school, take on all kinds of potential financial consequences, go find a different job, turn my life completely upside down, and that'll show those jerks in government. That's not. People don't do that. They do that on Facebook.
I'm pondering it. I am
but
pondering exactly that scenario. Pulling the kids out of school and no. So, oh gosh, what did I? Incentives. This word incentives is not exclusively the old carrot and stick analogy, but also, I think it's more nuanced than that. It has to do with opportunities, and like, if some opportunities just disappear or are not readily available or harder to attain than other opportunities, then that also steers our choices. So maybe that's the other side of the incentive coin. I just wanted to highlight that sometimes the word incentive puts in people's minds that old carrot and stick analogy, and that's really not, I think, what you meant by that.
No,
or maybe you did, but you also mean this other nuance.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance to that. There's a lot of complexity to when you talk about incentives. Antony mentioned a good example. If we were to get into a chasing our tails, ballooning inflation situation, that is going to sideline a lot of investors.
Yeah.
Not because
Not it will,
not
but
because
it
they're
is. It is
necessarily
sidelining.
losing money, but
Yeah.
they're just like, I don't feel confident about what's going on, and therefore I'm going to pull my chips off the table for a time and see what happens. And
Yeah,
and
but
that's that's
he and you have made a grammatical error here. It is not
Uh-oh.
future tense. Okay, this is present tense decision making. I just got a notice that I have low battery in my earpiece, so let me know if there's a trouble there. But yeah, in the present day, there are, I think, major shifts happening in business and in the marketplace of employers and corporations moving money around rapidly in the current market because of those people are hesitant to invest in one region, so they're going to move their money to another region. They're going to put a headquarters in this province instead of this other province. In fact, I know of an entrepreneur that just recently moved from Ontario to go out west precisely because of the tax regime here in Ontario. And even though Ontario is the tech hub of Canada, he literally picked up his headquarters and moved it from the tech hub out west, where he feels his business has a greater future. It's a better environment for business and employment and finding employees, and very, very interesting.
Well, speaking of incentives, our viewership has diminished by
Yeah,
20% in the last 10 minutes. So
we are
we
nowhere
must
near as interesting as Antony, obviously.
we're waning in our value here. So
Yeah.
we really appreciate those of you who have watched, those of you who might be watching in the future on YouTube. Please reach out, join us at Locals, interact with us. We'd be happy to chat. If you have suggestions for guests, it's been suggested by not less than a few people that so far our guests have tended to agree to a pretty good degree with our personal views, maybe, and that's come through or been apparent in the podcast. I always want to let you know I'm working diligently on trying to reach out to some people that I think have some really diametrically opposed views to what David or I maybe think. And we look forward to trying to flesh those out and get those invitations finalized and have some great discussions with people that can really provide some divergent points of view. So, I mean, that's definitely a major commitment that we're trying to make here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll just summarize. This is at Facebook, obviously. Probably tomorrow I'm going to upload this video to YouTube, where we keep our recordings available there. Also at fundamentalfreedoms.locals.com. You'll find us there. You can sign up, and I think it would be a great place to carry on some conversation, and you can become a member of Locals if you wish, to have access to some premium features for as little as $1 a month or so. And also at Locals, there are a variety of other podcasters and personalities that produce some excellent content. I have really enjoyed the conversation. I'm glad that you reached out to Antony and he was willing to join us. I'm going to rewatch some of his conversation with us so I can learn more about that and pick up his book. Steve, I don't know when we'll do this next. So until then, good night.
Good night to you, David. Thank you very much. And thank you.
And thank you.